The palace erupted with the voice of the girl, Rosetta. "There's up ahead!" The girl interrogated what was ahead, and there was a glass of water spilled in front, which she stepped on, slipped and fell. The character in our story is a Rosetta girl with bright pink hair. She is a maid in the imperial palace. She faints every chance she gets. She's also very clumsy. It's a terrible weakness that causes her to fall every time the opportunity arises. And now it's no exception, the third time this week. But the staff of the imperial palace has no hatred for Rosetta. If you exclude the good looks in her background, she has a charm that strangely draws people to her. The main reason that thwarted their opinion was that most of them fled after 3 days. The governess girls just like her gathered in the cleaning room, laughing at Rosetta, said, "We'll take care of everything, so you can go to him." The mad crowned prince. She is personally the maid of Armand Baldwin von Rogenar. Rosetta replied to her girlfriends, the governesses, "That fine, thank you." That's why Rosetta's in charge. The girl always noticed everything, just as she does now. As she approached the crowned prince's door, she saw 2 guards with a dagger sticking out from under their noses. Walking up to them, she said, "Excuse me, what are you doing here? Are you really going to kill the crowned prince?" With that, laughing, she said. They looked at each other and realized she couldn't survive. One of them said, "Rosetta is from the imperial palace, right?" And the other took the dagger in his hand and said, "Those who have seen what is unnecessary must die." "I'm sorry," Rosetta to one of the guards who had a dagger. He swung it at her and wanted to kill her. Well, as it turned out, that wasn't the case. Our Rosetta has a strong physicality. She twisted his arm and pointed the dagger straight at the guard. Stabbing him in the stomach, Rosetta shoved the guard away. "Your skills are good, so why use them specifically to kill?" she said. "You're hiding your identity," said the other. "Because of you, all attempts to kill the crowned prince have failed." Well, didn't that start talking to them? She swung that dagger and stabbed the second guard with it as well. Wiping her hands clean of blood, Rosetta said, "I'm sorry, Gerald, but those who have seen what is unnecessary must die." When Rosetta was done with the guards, she went to begin her duties, but another maid saw her in the hallway. With the words, "Where did you disappear to again?" she asked, but Rosetta replied, "I'm sorry. It's just that before, she accidentally fell into the pond, much forgotten. In fact, into the pond, she had dropped the 2 guards so that no one would find them. Then the maid said, "His Highness is waiting for you. Don't waste any more time and go to him." Rosetta said she was already running, and indeed she was, because she was already running late. At the door, Rosetta said, "I beg your pardon, Your Highness Armand. The current maid is now this Rosetta, but she's actually died 4 times. She must protect the crowned prince. This time she became a maid rather than a knight, and it was the right choice." Armand approached Rosette and said she was his rose, and he thought he would go crazy waiting for her. Why the hell did this guy change his attitude toward her? Rosetta thought. "The castle midnight. Valyrian, turn back time," Rosetta said. Valyrian replied that he didn't know what the side effects of that would be. The girl said she didn't care. Rosetta Mayfield is the strongest swordsman in the Empire. Suddenly the Grand Mage, the only swordmaster and also an escort knight under the direct control of the crowned prince, was unable to protect his master, not to break the one received personally from the crowned prince. Years back she still couldn't save him. He was still killed and stripped. Despite all this, Armand died again. He was killed even earlier than in his previous life. She would like to speak to the crowned prince and ask for his cooperation, but that plan fails as well. This is Rosetta's 5th attempt to save the newly crowned prince. Now her only option left was to take the position that would allow her to freely enter and exit the crowned prince's chambers. Therefore, Rosetta in this life became a maid, being able to accompany Armand everywhere. "There's a knock at the door, Your Highness. It's Maria here to introduce the new maid." This is where Rosetta spent the most time in her past life. Rosetta approached the crowned prince and introduced herself, saying that this was the first time they were seeing each other. "Her name is Rosetta, daughter of Baron Mayfield. She will be devoted to serving Your Highness." Prince Armand, sitting by the window and reading his book, said, "Good," and nothing more. Didn't even look at Rosetta's face. It really pissed her off. She thought, maybe I wasn't polite enough because I'm only a maid. It was the first time in Rosetta's life that she had been treated like nothing. But for the girl, it is more of an incentive. Then start today. She will slowly make her way into his heart. One of the maids named Melanie took an interest in Rosetta. After all, she was applying to be the crown prince's personal maid. She has poorly cut clothes, but a pretty face. She should change her closet first, then brag about her position. Seeing Rosetta in the hallway, she turned to her. "Gosh, Rosetta, your maid's uniform suits you better than that dress, don't you think?" the girl asked. Rosetta answered her. "Yes, this form is perfect for me." "Really, Melanie? Thank you so much, I really like this uniform," Rosetta said. "That girl," said Melanie, "she's got daisies for brains. She's pretty in the face, but she's stupid in the mind." Rosetta took Melanie's hands in hers, not spinning her around, with the words, "That maid costume suits you so well. I think we'll get along well in the future." For how many days after that, Melanie and the other maids watched Rosetta closely to uncover her true identity. But Rosetta's behavior didn't change. Melanie walked over to Rosetta and said, "Treat her to this cookie," bringing it especially for her from the kitchen. "Take a bite," she said. "Put that cookie in your mouth," Rosetta said. "Eat it yourself. Don't give it to others. It's just for you." You ate every last crumb. Maria, the maid, began to notice that Melanie now cared for Rosetta like a child. She used to hate her, but that was before. Rosetta, when she makes a mistake, is pointed out to her, apologizes immediately, learns from her missteps to do her job as well as possible. The rest of the time, she helps the other maids as well. "How can Melanie not hate Rosetta if she's just perfect?" "Also," Melanie said, "Rosetta's smile is just dazzling. A person with a smile like that makes their life easier, and even the Crown Prince Armand keeps her by his side. Oh, by the way, Melanie, about the Crown Prince, you cleaned his chambers, didn't you?" Maria asked. Going about her business, Rosetta noticed that Melanie was not crying. She asked her, "What's wrong?" Maria replied that Melanie had to clean His Highness's room today. Rosetta then interjected, "So why is Melanie reacting with tears?" Maria replied that the girl was scared. "Didn't you hear that rumor that His Highness is crazy?" Rosetta turned to Melanie, calling out to her. Without turning around, asked, "What?" Melanie said she would go in her place, the crowned prince, and clean it up there. Rosetta gave some instructions. "Be sure to knock twice on the door, and afterward say what you came for. Then you must wait for the crowned prince to answer." Rosetta did so. When she reached the door, she knocked twice and said, "Your Highness, she has come to clean his chambers." His Highness, the crowned prince, told her to come in. "It's about time we started the taming phase of Armand," Rosetta thought. As she entered the room and began to clean up, she pondered how she could gain his favor. Armand seems to like it when the maids silently leave after they're done with the cleaning. If she does that, she'll just be a good maid. But if she gets too close to him too quickly, it might arouse suspicion, the girl thought. On his way to the throne, Armand was the second claimant. He has gone through many hardships, so he trusts no one. He didn't even have a personal servant. He keeps a close eye on the servants while cleaning. That's why no one wants to serve him. They say he's crazy. However, he does have a very demanding job. Rosetta went to the window and opened it to let in fresh air from the street. She said, "Your Highness, I'm done with the cleaning." The crowned prince became angry, saying, "What is this? The weather is so beautiful today. Why don't we leave the windows open?" Rosetta said, "Warm sunshine and a nice breeze." "Watermelon," Armand said. "If you're done cleaning up, you can go." Rosetta replied, "All right." At the end, just about to leave, she turned around and said that if he needed anything, he could call her any time. As she left the room, there was a scream. It was unasked Rosetta. "Did you hit yourself again? Be careful." Armand heard all this and decided that Rosetta the maid was a fool. It wasn't S. Once again asked Rosetta if she was okay, and nothing happened after she cleaned up the prince's room. Rosetta replied to Melanie that it was all right and she was a tough enough girl. Wasn't made the remark. Of course she was. How one should be more careful. It was unknowable, Rosetta said, that she wanted to be the prince's personal maid. It wasn't much of a surprise, having said that even experienced maids refused to do that. "Are you sure you can handle it?" The newspaper replied, "Of course I can manage. The prince is very friendly with her." Wasn't saying, "Oh, please don't faint in front of him." The next day Rosetta came again to the crowned prince's house to clean, but he was surprised. She had said it was once a day, but she came every day. Very strange, he thought. Although, however, the past maid always acted suspiciously. They turned their backs and fiddled with something, or disappeared silently from sight. He'd never seen Rosetta do that. It's not so bad, he thought. Rosette, when she finished cleaning up, decided to ask the prince again, who told him that the weather was great today too, and if he wanted to go for a walk today, with the window at that. "Your room is always so clean. How do you manage that?" asked Rosetta. "All because you're so clean," Armand thought. Come to think of it, she's too chatty. Though there's one dirty one among the maids, says her room has always been full of junk since she was a child. A place just for sleeping. Rosetta asked the prince if he was hungry. It has been very tasty recently. The prince said, enough talk, you can go. Rosetta said, okay, only to leave, to try to tell him something else. Today she was helping the maid in the laundry room and something strange happened there. But the prince didn't want to hear it and told her to clean up. Rosetta went to the door thinking, surely he doesn't allow himself too much, especially talking to the maids. As she walked down the hall, she kept thinking. She'd been trying so hard for weeks, and his heart hadn't warmed to her, but she can't let that happen. She'll try again tomorrow. With cheerful thoughts, Rosetta went on cleaning. Rosette Day also, as always, came to His Highness to clean his room. Stepping into the room, she said, Your Highness, this is Rosetto. Good morning. But the crowned prince answered nothing. Today, she thought, today is just like always. And then Rosetto, as always, fainted and right on top of the prince. With the words, Excuse me, Your Highness, Rosetta tried to stand up. The prince asked, And what does that mean? Here, for some reason, Rosetta put her finger in the prince's mouth and said, Open your mouth more, Your Highness. Armand accidentally bit her finger. Rosetta said, Ouch! Leaning in, it said, Forgive her for her rudeness. And at one point, leaning toward him, she kissed him. The crowned prince couldn't understand what was going on. But again, under some circumstances, Rosetta lost consciousness and woke up already in the prince's bed. She sat down on the bed and said, Ah, Your Highness. The prince looked at her and said that he would now keep an eye on her. A little earlier, Rosetta's kiss with the prince before fainting. There was a reason for the kiss. When Rosetta walked in on the prince this morning, she had only one thought. How can I get along with the crowned prince quickly? She needs to be in the role of a knight again. As she approached the table, she smelled her favorite smell of black tea. The smell definitely confused her, because it was Setar's poison. He had already drunk the poison, and she had to help him. When Rosetta tried to help the prince, he called for his assistant Richard. Richard ran into the room with the words of Your Highness, you called for me. Richard saw that the prince was lying on the floor. Your Highness, what has happened? Need to call a priest, shouted he. Rosetta, all she could say was call a priest and passed out. Then Rosetta faints. Not the first time in the years she's been trying to save the prince. And fainting is all because of a weak 20-year-old body. Now back to the present, she asks how she knew there was poison in the tea somewhere, laughed and said, Just that the smell was familiar to her. She asked, Tell me the prince has already caught the culprit. The prince replied that the perpetrator had committed suicide. Rosetta said, How are you feeling? The prince said, Yes, that's why he's here with her. She couldn't believe that the man who ignored her was keeping up their conversation. The prince said he was fine. But there was very too much poison in the rosette, and maybe she would die because of it. A few days later, Rosetta wondered what it was all of a sudden, then realized, that's why he was talking so sweetly to her. The prince said, If there's anything you like, buy. He might have died if she hadn't been around. Well, the rosette said, No, ordinary people will die when they drink a large amount of poison, even if they get rid of it quickly. But she is an exception. She is a knight who possesses swordsmanship, but she can't tell him that truth. Or does she need to tell him that she has a special body? Oh no, wait. This is her chance to get close to him. And the girl. It's all right, Your Highness. Nothing is your fault, she said. Maybe she'll die. She's very tough. The prince looked at the girl and thought that he already knew she was stupid. But after the poisoning, she was completely out of her mind, and told her he was afraid it was unlikely, her assumption. Then Rosetta said, May I ask Your Highness for a favor? Please let her be by your side. As his personal maid, she will do her best. The prince said, Well, she's going to die. In a few days, apparently she hasn't realized it yet. Untrustworthy, so she knew. In a family with a bad relationship, even the silver and gold they are entitled to will not help. It is better to support you to the last, then at least honor will remain. For Armand to fulfill such a request is harder than giving money or power, but nevertheless, he chose to go through these hardships, thus paying for his life. The prince stood up and walked over to Rosetta, putting his hand on her shoulder. He said, Good. He will grant her last wish. Rosetta had already managed to draw up a contract for the prince by bringing it to him. She said, Her name is Rosetta Mayfield, but some people call her Rose or Rosie. She was born on a day when roses are in full bloom. Armand answered her, You don't have much time left, and you keep talking a lot. Okay, then she'll be quiet. And will you read what she gave you? Rosetta said. Prince Armin Baldwin von Ragnar of the Empire of Ragnar gives his consent for Rosetta Mayfield to become his personal maid, until Rosetta dies. Get out of the prince's room! Melanie razzed. So she screamed, meaning, Are you dying? It can't be! And the girl cried very hard. Hurriedly I calmed her down and told her that no, it was just a misunderstanding. I'm not dying. Really? Melanie asked. Of course, replied Rosetta. The lighting to her has already fixed her up and she needn't worry, and her health will be all right. Rosetta said she didn't have a scratch on her body in perfect condition. Bella didn't ask again. Are you sure you're okay? And heard the answer. Of course. She was so relieved, she said. What a relief. It's so late, Melanie said. Let's sleep in her room tonight. Got permission from the head maid. As the girl settled down, Melanie didn't say what she was feeling right now that brought back memories from her childhood. This situation of them lying together. The newspaper also thought, that's true. If you think about it that way, while she was a knight, she didn't have time to make friends. Turns out it's such a nice feeling, you know, Melanie said. There's someone she wants to be friends with. Tell me how to get close to him, Rosetta asked. Wasn't jumped up and said it was a man. Rosetta said, yes, a man. But immediately she thought it was a good idea to ask her if she might not be. Melanie asked, Is that Sir Richard? Well then she said, probably not. Okay, well it's probably not Richard, but it's still pathetic. Well then, if you want to get close to a man, it's best to do it through touch, Melanie said. The next day Rosetta came to the prince. He doesn't need any help while bathing. He doesn't have such obscene habits, Armin said. It's a lot more comfortable when you have help, Rosetta said. He's already said he doesn't do that kind of nonsense, but she keeps insisting. Could she be planning something? The prince asked. Well, a finger at her. After what he said, any noble lady would run away in shame. But Rosetta's not a scaredy cat. She said that back then. The prince cried out in horror. Are you really going to wash my body? Rosetta at this point thought he realized that she wanted to get close to him. When the bath was over, Rosetta offered to help your highness change his clothes. But Armin became agitated again and said he could do it himself. The newspaper hurried out of his room. How stubborn he is. As she left the room, she heard, Is that you now about his highness? Speaking. When Rosetta turned around, she saw Sir Richard. Rosetta asked that what he had heard be kept secret. Sir Richard coughed and said, Sure, no problem. He also asked how Rosetta was feeling. Rosetta replied that she was full of strength and energy. Don't worry. The news about her speed, it's just a rumor. Richard replied that he had heard from the other maids. Rosetta turned to Richard. He was so rude to her yesterday. Oh, so you want to talk about it? Rosetta asked. She replied that she was fine. She thinks he should worry more about the crowned prince. His health is paramount. Richard replied Rosetta her words were worthy of respect. The devotion with which she put his highness's health above her own. What's he doing all of a sudden? She thought. The praise from the older knight seemed a little strange to her. Richard asked Rosetta, Are you free this weekend? Why? She just doesn't have a free weekend. At one point the door opens and the prince comes out saying, I have urgent business. We'll need help. The prince swept up that just now Rosette was targeting his body, and then she was already flirting with Richard. She asked, Are you heading to the main palace? Let her have some pasta. But the prince replied, No need. You'll carry his sun umbrella, telling interesting stories along the way. The prince continued. The prince became indignant. Damn, that maid won't let up. He said to her, All right, I'll listen to you while you carry the umbrella. Once outside, the guards brought out a huge, large, heavy umbrella with a wooden stick. The prince said, Well, Rosetta, take your umbrella and let's go tell me stories. Richard, when he saw this huge umbrella, said, But this umbrella is too heavy. Can you give it to a fragile girl? With such a frail body, she's holding it up, he thought. But it wasn't to be. Rosetta picked up that umbrella with ease, put it on her shoulder, and carried it with the stories she promised to share. So, the tears of Erkia are actually earrings. They are owned by the king of the Aspel Empire. Walking down the road, Rosetta pranced and realized that judging by the look on his face, he wasn't at all interested in what she was telling him. After all, she's known the prince for years, so she can tell immediately by the look in his eyes. The prince asked Rosetta, How does she know so much? She replied that she didn't know. It was so long ago, so she wouldn't remember. The fact is, she's the one who killed this king, and she took those earrings for herself. But she can't tell the prince. That said, that's it for today with the stories, the prince interjected. Why all? Because they're already here. Richard asked Rosetta. I'm ashamed to admit it, but he was really caught up in the story, so he didn't have time to ask her how she was able to carry such a heavy umbrella. The girl replied, Sir Richard, you seem to underestimate the work of a maid. It wasn't hard at all, and among the other maids she is considered quite strong. The prince thought for a moment. Come to think of it, she seemed very strong to him too. She grabbed him with her lips. Rosetta walked and thought about how some umbrella was no match for a sword. Even so, the body of a 20-year-old is much weaker than what she had when she was years old. It would take about a year to become a sword master, just like in her previous life. Rosetta sat down, sad, very upset. She works as a maid and has time to exercise. She'll have to see Valyrian and see if anyone can make one. Valyrian Windsorfrud. At the age of 15 he became the great wizard of the Empire Ragnar, a young genius. The pride of the Empire, who gave up the title of Master of the Magic Tower and dedicated himself to the imperial family. Also for Rosetta, he is a close friend, even closer than a family member. So the maids don't leave the palace often, and she rarely sees him. Rosie was walking through the garden when she heard someone call out to her, and she saw Valyrian there. He screamed that he missed her. He raised his hand, and Rosa thought he wanted to hit her. She says to him, "In the garden of the imperial palace, what are you doing?" Rosetta shouted, "What's annoying? I mean, he could have dodged it, but he didn't, you pervert." He's not a pervert, he said, and he didn't shy away from pleasing her. When Windsorfrud's family fell as children, Rosetta's mother, Baroness Mayfield, sheltered Valyrian. Rosetta was a protector to him, related to his sister. About her as his younger sister, whom he lost after the fall of the family. Parasites, on the other hand, was like an older brother. She felt comfortable around him. Valyrian's only flaw was that he continued to show his excessive tactility to Rosetta. He clearly divides the presence of other people into work and personal. So why is he acting like a puppy with her? But when he looks at her face, he forgives Rosetta for everything she says and does to him. Keep your cool. In the past, I've had to constantly suffer through rumors about us. She's a maid here, so she has to be extra careful, Rosetta said. Right. Last time you said you were a knight. Right. When are you going to tell me about it? Said Valyrian. We'll come to his lab as soon as she's sorted things out, the girl said. She also added not to worry him. She'll have more fun in this life since she has friends. Valyrian couldn't believe that Rosie was able to make friends. He was proud of her and wanted to hug her, holding his arms out to her. Well, Rose, she said. No, someone's coming. He wants to ruin her chances of marriage again. But Valyrian says the footsteps are too far away and we'll have time to hug without anyone seeing. Rosetta agreed. She walked over to Valyrian and hugged him like the best friend from her stepbrother. She said she wouldn't fall for it next time. She's a well-mannered girl after all, Valyrian said. Don't let her get sick when I'm not around, he added. And the boys split up, each going about his own business. Rose walked just a few steps as she saw His Highness. The prince, leaning over to Rosette, asked, "Who was that beside you just now?" His gaze was very angry. Rosetta thought he saw her cuddling with Valyrian. Being a maid, she had completely forgotten that Armand was being trained as a crowned prince. His eyesight was better developed than most knights, so there was no hiding from him. Rosetta thought she should act natural and said, "This is a friend of hers. He works in the main palace." Prince said that the guy was quite tall. Rosie replied, "Yes, he has a great build." The prince wondered if it was possible that she was secretly seeing someone. Rosie, as I read it in his eyes, also thought it was likely he thought I was probably dating Valyrian. Rose was upset that things might end because of his suspicions. He kept asking questions. "What does your friend do?" And Rosetta said she was fine, but she put her handkerchief to her mouth, coughed, and bled. Then she grabbed her head as if she felt sick and fainted again. The prince grabbed Rosetta in time to keep her from hitting the ground. She liked it so much that he caught her that she had never expected him to do that. Of course he doubts her, but he is still plagued by a guilty conscience. Rosetta couldn't pass up an opportunity like this. "Thank you," she said, "for catching me, Your Highness. She is alive because of you." "What are you talking about?" the prince asked, not understanding. Rosetta said it was all because of her, but in the prince's mind, there were completely different thoughts. He thought he had already killed her, and the look on his face said so. "Didn't you like me?" His response. She'd thought it would be completely different. And not to take this conversation any further, she said she was fine. And besides, if he was out in the sun for long enough, his skin would suffer. Better get back. The prince didn't resist and said she was right. He feels a slight tingling sensation. He has to go back. When they came back, that's when Rosetta decided to continue their conversation again and thanked Your Highness for picking her up. He must have practiced a lot outside then for such a reaction. Well, the prince remained silent in response. Rosetta then offered to help him change his clothes, but the prince refused. "Armand," he said, "disengage, lest she misunderstand him. It would ruin his reputation if she fell in front of him and he did nothing." Rosetta was upset again. She had put so much effort into what she had done. He had just looked at her with sad eyes, and then everything was wrong again. He pretends not to like her after all, but he actually cares a lot. He reminded her of a cat she had as a child. Rosetta immediately remembered the situation when she was sitting on the chair with the cat and stroking it, and Valeria came over and started saying that it was unfair. "You always play only with Rosetta." The cat was very sweet and loved Rosetta. "The prince said he only asked me to clean his bedroom, so please hurry up and leave." He noticed that Rosetta was smiling at him. It was strange. Rosetta said, "Okay, I hear you," and set about cleaning up. She noticed that there was a vase of flowers on the table, and the flowers were completely wilted. These flowers have been here for quite some time. She couldn't believe the prince was into that sort of thing. Maybe the maid left it, she thought, carrying the vase to replace the flowers. But the prince stopped her and told her to leave it alone. Rosetta asked, "Oh, are these flowers from someone dear to you?" The prince replied, "Yes." Rosetta was immediately upset, and she began to speculate who the flowers might be from. Maybe it was Lady Lunella who gave them to her. The Lunella clan, as the only duchy in the empire, was closely related to the Ragnar royal family, which helped consolidate its power. Paisley Teresa von Lunella, the only daughter in the family. Her name was enough to make her a member of secular society. Rosetta's half-sister was trying to get Lady Lunella's attention. Rosetta herself did not wish for something like this. When she was a top knight, Rosetta hadn't even crossed paths with Lady Lunella. No less, Rosetta remembered her well. For a few years later, Lady Lunella married Armand, the prince. This marriage was formal because of Armand's difficult character. They had a rather cold relationship. Maybe something has changed since he's talking about a dear one. Well, if those two get along, she'll be better off, Rosetta thought as she put the vase of flowers back in its place and set about making the bed. The prince again decided to admonish her and told her that she was frequenting him with her cleaning. Rosetta twisted herself by saying that changing his bedding daily was good for his skin. "Just an appearance," the prince said. "To bother so much?" Said, "How can you say that with your looks like that, Your Highness? Your skin should be soft and beautiful." If the point of talking about it is simple, looking at her already feels good. Armand had no doubts about his beauty, but those around him were afraid to say it out loud. Rosetta's words were the first, something about his looks. She became agitated. "How can you say that? If your looks are your most important asset, if it weren't for your face, she wouldn't be here." The prince scolded her, saying that she was mad and had lost her fear if she dared to say such things to the prince. Rosetta realized that she had gotten very agitated and overreacted. Again, she has to get out of it somehow. She apologized to the prince and cried. Her imminent death didn't even upset her that much. The prince asked her why she was silent. She thought, "Will she die in this life and not Armun?" She said, "Okay," and thought to kneel down as usual. Since she is a former knight, she has an out-of-the-box mindset. The prince said, "Forget it, you're sick." But she answered him that she was mistaken, "Your Highness," and apologized. And still she knelt, just as she had intended. Basically, he scolded her, taking her hand and lifting her up. "I told you." He grabbed her arm, then wrapped his hand around her arm in a single girth. He couldn't understand why her arm was so thin. Rosetta rejoiced that dropping to her knees seemed to work. The prince asked, "Do you like boats at Rosetta's?" Rosetta exclaimed, "Of course I like it very much." Then he predicted, "Meet me tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the morning." He added, "We'll give her some good memories before she dies." Rosetta finished cleaning up and left the room. She couldn't believe that Armand had suggested meeting first, though maybe he was just determined to confuse the issue. The next morning came, as they had agreed with Rosetta, at 1 o'clock in the morning. She came to the garden. Armand, the prince, and his assistant Richard were walking toward her. Rosetta had only one thought, that he had really come and had not deceived her. She decided to pinch herself on the cheek, thinking it was a dream. But then the prince said, "Stop yawning and get in the carriage." And Rosetta immediately perked up. Since he was being so rude, it must not be a dream. When everyone had already settled down in the carriage, it drove toward the pond. The prince's first question to Rosetta was that she had to wear this. Rosetta replied that she didn't have the right clothes for that. Richard asked, "Haven't you still had things brought to you from the baron's estate?" Rosetta said they brought it in, but it's the most appropriate outfit for a boat ride. She can't believe there are no more dignified clothes for aristocrats. The aristocrat who became a maid stands with calloused hands. She must have been mocked at Mayfield Manor. As the carriage traveled, the prince reflected on the fact that she had been mistreated all her life and had become a servant, so she would also die in his place. And Rosetta reflected on the fact that it was so uncomfortable to train in skirts, so she always had only pants. Is the lack of clothes such a big deal? She thought. And then the prince broke the silence by saying to Rosetta, "If you need clothes, I'll buy them." Rosetta, of course, was glad he was concerned about her, but said she was thankful and didn't need it at all. Richard looked at her and thought, so politely and firmly refused. Rosetta said she already had everything she needed, but she needed something else entirely. If he wanted to do something nice for her, he'd better not be dead, Rosetta thought. Kutsera's voice rang out. "We've arrived. You may step out of the carriage." Rosetta was the first to jump out of the carriage to help him down, but Richard, the prince's aide, told Rosetta to help get off the carriage. That's his job. Rosetta quickly apologized, saying she was confused. When they looked around, there was a beautiful view of the lake all around, and there was a boat already floating on it, with trees, flowers, and blue water all around. Rosetta saw how beautiful the lake was, and said to the prince, "It is not pretty, your highness. Shall we hurry to the boat?" The prince said she could go. Rosetta interjected, "Pardon me, your highness, may I ask?" But at that moment she is interrupted by the prince. He says, "Why do you think not?" She got it right. It meant she would sail alone, the prince said. Everything she might need is already in the boat. She's going alone. Rosetta was very surprised that anyone would enjoy boating alone. She doesn't even like that. And chatting about nothing is better. She'll spend that time practicing with her sword. Yet she had only accepted the offer because she wanted to spend time alone with Armand. Would she really go alone? Rosetta was a little upset, and tears came to her eyes. The prince saw Rosetta crying and said he would sail with her. So be it. In that time, Rosetta had managed to do a lot to make that prince think otherwise. "Really," she said. "Will you really sail with me?" "Thank you very much, your highness." The prince added that he would only sail with her if she kept her mouth shut. It's been a year since Rosetta has served his highness. I can't even believe he gave her this opportunity. She'll be sure to thank him, Prince Richard, that he's staying here and not sailing with them. For safety, at least one person needs to be on shore, he said. Richard said, "Good," he understood the prince. "Good reason. Thanks to a motor equal to horsepower, the boat moves automatically. It's not as bad as Rosetta thought. And the scenery here, what a view. These vistas are like a painting." "Is it?" endured Rosetta's silence for so long, and still asked the prince if he liked boating. The prince replied, "No." This was interjected. "Why not?" The prince immediately had a memory of his childhood involving water. He shouted, and a boy standing on the ground saw and shouted, "Look at him!" He can't protect anyone, not even himself. Prince said there are some unpleasant memories associated with it. "Well, he said not to worry about it, it's fine," he asked Rosetta. "You were assigned to my palace? Had to go through a lot?" Rosetta says, "Appointed how? I came here voluntarily." Surprised, he interjected, "How voluntarily?" He knows that servants don't want to work in the palace. So why did she volunteer? Rosetta said, "You see, your highness, I am here to protect you." The prince coughed and asked, "I wonder if that's enough strength for you to protect him." "Your highness, you saw her holding that umbrella, and she already saved him once. Have you forgotten?" "Yes, because of that, your life," said the prince. And then something happened to the boat's mechanism. It staggered violently. At this moment Rose was standing, and as the boat staggered she fell upon the prince. The prince said, "You couldn't save your life?" How easily it fell from some tremor. "So how are you going to protect me?" the prince asked. They lay like that for a while, looking at each other. Rosetta's heart was racing, so fast that she could hear it. For Rosetta, tactile contact was nothing to be ashamed of. just like she did with Valyrian, holding hands, lightly hugging, something that could be done casually. Well, that's what it's about this time, she thought. Why is she so embarrassed? She must not show her embarrassment at him and tried to visualize Valyrian. The newspaper was able to pull itself together. She said, "Thank you very much, Your Highness. You saved my life." But the prince didn't like it. He shouted at her, "That's enough! How long are you going to sit on me?" Rosetta got up from the prince and moved to just on their laps and said so she wouldn't fall again. She would sit like this now. But then when she looked into his eyes and saw his displeasure and anger, she moved to her seat and said, "No, I can't afford that. It's His Highness's thigh to sit on. More comfortable?" he asked, not quite understanding how she could be the kind of person who made her run out of time. Why is she acting so casually as if nothing had happened? You're risking your life to protect his life. Of course, said Rosetta. She immediately thought about the fact that the reason she had started back was because Armand had been her first failure. She blamed herself for failing to protect her master, but as she regressed, she realized that all emotions were gradually forgotten, and the only wish left in her mind is that she just wants him to live. But he won't even know that if he's a regular person. He needs to keep him alive. So the reason why she wants to protect the prince will remain a big secret. After all, every maid has her secrets, said Rosetta. Here she has her own secret. The prince objected. That's ridiculous. Rosetta said that in any case she was sincere in her desire to protect you, Your Highness. Prince said there were many people earlier who said the same thing she did. But all those people... He stopped talking for some reason, because the boat stopped moving. Rosetta interjected. A faulty motor, is it? I doubt it could just be a coincidence. The boat stalled. She said, Your Highness, be careful. It's very deep. But she turned toward the prince, and he was no longer in the boat. She shouted, Your Highness! But he was already going down. When the prince was drowning, he couldn't believe it was serious. He couldn't think of anything else. Everyone who said such words always betrayed him. But Rosetta is a knight. She jumped into the water to save the prince, and it was very hard to pull it out of the water, since she has the body of a 20-year-old girl, and with no training. But she had it all worked out. Pulling the prince up to the boat so he could at least lean against it, she asked, Your middle name? Are you all right? Yes, he's all right, replied the prince. Alive then, thank God, said Rosetta. She wrapped her arms around him under his shoulders and swam with him to the shore. Richard was already shouting, Your Highness, get a rope! They'd need rope, water, something to help them. Yes. Rosetta calmly took Your Highness in her arms and carried him out of the water. Walking over to Richard, she said that taking His Highness to his room as soon as possible was necessary. Richard brought the prince into the room. They put him on the bed and covered him with a warm blanket. They sat and waited for him to wake up. After a while the prince woke up and Richard asked, Your Highness, how are you? You're awake at last. Richard addressed the prince about using magic to dry and change his clothes. He might as well not worry about the rumors. When the prince woke up, he asked again, And how long has it been since I was unconscious? Richard replied, It's been less than an hour. The prince asked, Did anyone else see him? Beside Richard said that he had moved him as inconspicuously as possible, so that no one would have to see anything. The prince asked, Then why didn't the high priest come? Richard replied that the junior priest gave first aid, but it is said that the first prince was injured while sparring, and the high priest came to you late. But the prince objected. It's a bad legend because sparring is ridiculous. The current empress and the mother of the first prince tried to subdue the temple about it. They openly display their relationship. Suddenly the body stopped, became motionless. The high priest was gone. The prince said, That's enough and they can go. Rosetta said she could go too. But the prince said, No, she needs to stay. Rosetta said, All right, I'll stay. She wondered for what reason he'd left her, because she was so brazen, or for carrying him in her arms like a princess for the second time. Sitting down on the bed, he said, Twice I owe her my life. After saying that, Rosetta got upset and cried a little. She was very pleased. Well? The prince asked. Are you crying? Rosetta said, No. The prince once more interjected. Had he done something wrong? No, you did it all, it's all right, Highness, thanked her. It became very pleasant. She stood there and thought about how very happy she was. She had finally been able to reach him after so much time and so many things she had done for him. It had been worth it. Said if she wanted anything she should tell him right away. He'd listen to even the strangest wish. That, she said, that you needn't worry. The orders, and she doesn't need anything. She has everything and she's safe, Your Highness. The prince said it was the price for his life. It was only natural that he would be willing to pay her in any way he could. Say what you want. Silver, gold, treasure, he'll give it all to her. The outlet really had everything, and she didn't need anything. But there was just one but. When on the boat she had hugged him, she had gotten a certain feeling. She wanted to do it again. She and asked her only wish. Hug me, Your Highness, said the rosette. The prince opened his mouth. He asked, Is that what you really want? Then fine. If that's all you really want, I'll do it. The prince stood up and took the rosette in his arms, placing it on the bed. Rosetta asked, Your Highness, do you have to cuddle me on the bed? And then the prince said, he thought it would be more comfortable that way. Now get off his bed, and he laughed. She said, Your Highness, she thinks he is right. It's only natural to charge a large fee for life. When Rosetta got up, she went to the window and wanted to open it. The prince at that moment interrogated her. Do you want something else? Rosetta turned to him and said, Yes. The prince asked, Do you still want more? Just need to be more specific? Rosetta said she wanted something more. The prince asked in bewilderment what she meant. Rosetta lifted up the skirt on one of her legs, and she had a letter, or rather a contract, pinned there. She pulled it out and started listing the things she would like. For example, you could hold hands. Or a cuddle, a tea party would work too, she added. Then she unfolded the contract and showed it to him, saying, Please fulfill one request of mine once a day. The prince asked, Why do you carry that contract under your skirt? Rosetta said she carried it around because she didn't want anyone to see it. The prince said he didn't particularly like all this, but it was the price of his life and he had no choice. He agreed. They walked with Rosetta to the table to record this wish in the contract. The prince thought she was going to die anyway, and it wouldn't be for long. A maid knocked on the door and said that the priest had arrived and the archmage was here as well. Rosetta heard archmage and thought Valyrian, he's here too. If he sees her, he'll go crazy. A disheveled bed, wet clothes, Rosetta thought, tangled hair. As a child, Valyrian nearly killed the son of an aristocrat who was hurting her. Rosetta hastened to try to leave, saying, Excuse me, Your Highness. But the prince interrupted her, saying, Wait a minute. The people standing outside the door couldn't understand what was going on, or why it was taking so long to let them in. Finally, they heard the word, Come in. Everyone entered the room. The guests bowed and said, The servant of the Fenrir Temple welcomes His Highness the Crowned Prince. Valyrian also said, Greetings, His Highness the Crowned Prince, and bowed. The prince put his hand on Rosetta's hair and began to arrange it. Rosetta asked, Why, Your Highness, are you playing with my hair? But the prince replied, Do you think they won't understand if your hair is mussed? It's the first time he's styling a maid's hair as it is. So don't move, please, he said. Valyrian tried to answer. At first he said, Rose, then remembered that he had not come to see her, and began to say that he had heard that His Highness had had an accident, and had taken the liberty of visiting him. The prince said, Have the rumors already reached the main palace? Valyrian smiled and said, That there is no place in the imperial palace that his gaze cannot reach. The priest has arrived and you children are much better than he anticipated. He said he would come out with a maid. You, Your Highness, will need treatment, Valyrian continued, so I will go, and said goodbye. Just as they moved to leave, the prince poked his finger and said Rosetta was staying. Rosetta asked, Why? Why should I stay? And then Valyrian started to get nervous, if it bothered the crowned prince. But Rosetta tried to calm him down and spoke. Valyrian, hold on, please. They can't end it like this, and she only got what she wanted. The prince said, Do you want to die? Stop talking. Stay and get treatment. Rosetta laughed and said, Good, thinking to herself that he was worried about her after all. When Valyrian left, the priest began his healing duties. He walked over to the prince, unbuttoned his shirt, and touched his hands to his chest. Let me put some power to his wounds. At this moment Rosetta was watching all this and thinking to herself of him asking her for treatment. He is very much like a cat, caring, gentle. Rosetta also noticed that the last time he'd taken a bath, he'd been very worried that she might see him naked. Now he didn't seem to care. The prince told the priest that when he had finished his treatment with him, he would ask him to treat his maid. That maid drank a sip of poison a few days ago, the prince told the priest. They also said she will die soon. Priest, can you help her so she won't suffer pain? Said the prince. Rosetta was angry about something. She thought, "Is it because you fell in the lake?" The priest remarked that he couldn't believe the prince was so concerned about the maid. He said that he would do everything in his hands. Rosetta couldn't let that happen. No, and if he tried his best, they'd find out she wasn't running out of time, and there was nothing they could do about it. Now that all this had happened, "Your Highness, she can't afford treatment right now," Rosetta said. "She is very shy, so she would like to be treated by a priestess." The prince was indignant. "Is she saying she's shy?" Valyrian interjected. "What do you mean?" But then Valyrian pulled himself together to defend Rosetta and said, "After all, you have to appear in the nude to get treatment. It might be a little embarrassing to show yourself to the opposite sex completely naked." Valyrian took Rosetta by the waist, and they began to move slowly towards the exit, with the words that he would make sure the maid was taken care of. "Get well soon, Your Highness." When Valyrian and Rosetta came out of the prince's room, they laughed that they were blasted and everything was fine. When they arrived, they sat down at a table to have tea. Rosetta said, "Thank you for your help, Valyr. You're welcome." Valyrian asked, "Lady, what kind of tea do you want?" Rosetta replied that she was the kind of person who didn't like to waste magic. Valyrian held out the cup to Rosetta and said he was drinking tea with his rose. "So why not use it?" "Why have you come to the palace of the crowned prince?" asked Rosetta. Valyrian interrupted her and said, "Wait, why didn't you tell me?" Rosetta asked in surprise. "What?" she should have said. "Like what? Who was it, the one who poisoned you?" asked Valyrian. "He's already dead, suicide, or he's been silenced," Rosetta said. "Either way, she's not susceptible to poison." Valyrian got angry and said he would never forgive her for that. She kept quiet and didn't tell him. "Ah, she should have told him before," thought Rosetta. "Now she will be reproached with it." Valyrian asked, "What about the fall into the lake? You said something was wrong with the boat." "Then suddenly His Highness lost consciousness and fell into the lake," Rosetta said. Valyrian interjected, "But why did he fall unconscious into the lake?" Rosetta replied, "A faulty motor and sudden fainting. It's most likely that a small amount of poison has accumulated," he said. Rosetta said that if that's the case, it must be an assassination attempt. Valyrian interjected, "Was there anything suspicious in the room?" Rosetta hesitated. "His Highness's room is always clean and tidy, because I clean it every day. The only thing that bothers me is that there was a flower there. It dried up a long time ago, so I remembered it. It's still standing there." "Then he needs to look at it," Rosetta said. "Valyrian will help, but he's very worried about Rosetta. You may be a knight, but you don't have a sword right now." "Don't worry about me," Rosetta said. "I always carry a sword hidden in my hem. The means of time magic and the sword that His Highness granted her back in her first life." Rosetta asked, "Is it that important sword?" Valyrian said, "No, the prince, the one you tried so many times to save. He is her master, whom she has chosen to serve," Rosetta said. "It's her choice, so he's going to honor it whether he likes it or not. But he won't tolerate her being in danger either, so he's going to keep an even better eye on her." Rosetta hugged Valyrian and told him, "Thank you." In every life he had helped her, and this time she was sure it would be the last. When Rosetta and Valyrian had separated, she wandered the corridors of the castle and pondered. The money, he just lied. And the meetings with him. As for the vase, Valyrian will let her know and the results tomorrow. She really hopes the vase isn't the cause of all this because this flower is from Lady Luniella. Rosetta was right, and traces of tampering with the boat's motor are found. Rosetta reads a letter from Valyrian. As expected, she guessed it. Maybe it was because she'd become a maid this time. There's a lot going on and she can't relax. The next morning, Rosetta met the other maids in the hallway, and everyone greeted each other. "Good morning." Rosetta met Sir Richard in the hallway and greeted him as well. "Good morning." Richard also replied, "Good morning." She wondered if Sir Richard had always been like this. After all, this life is full of unexpected turns and problems. Walking into Armin's room, Rosetta said, "Good morning, Your Highness." Rosetta noticed that the room was a mess and asked, "Why is this place so untidy?" She also noticed that the prince had his hair styled differently. "He looks better with his hair back." Yesterday the Archmage said he had some doubts about that too, so he decided to check the room for poison. Rosetta asked what the result was after the search. The prince said, "Flowers in a vase." Then he added, "Though no, you don't need to know that." As she came closer to the conversation, she heard from the priest's words what he told her. "Yes, I am stronger than you think, so I can live longer, Rosetta," pronounced the prince. The prince smirked and said, "Just a few days longer?" "No," said Rosetta. "It is much longer than His Highness thinks. But now she needs to start cleaning up because the place is really dirty." The prince said, "Don't touch it, Rosetta." She interjected, "Ah, you want some more rest?" "No, he doesn't want her to do the cleaning, just," turned Rosetta. "But she's a maid. She can't not clean." The prince was outraged, but said he was just telling her not to overdo it, and warned her that she might faint. Rosetta said, "Your Highness, but I am your personal maid, and I must clean the rooms. And actually, she is very happy to serve His Highness with all her heart. Don't take that joy away from her, okay?" asked Rosetta. "And actually, she has to clean this room every day to be able to come here," and said to the prince. The prince nodded his head and hand, saying, "Do as you wish, Rosetta." Thanking him, she walked toward the exit. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. The maid said, "Madame LeBlanc requests an audience." The prince said, "Show her into the drawing room. I will receive her there." A woman ran into the living room with the words, "Your Highness." She was very anxious. Running up to the prince, she took his hands in hers. "What are you doing here, Betty?" said the prince. He obviously knew her well. "What's wrong with you? What happened yesterday?" she screamed. The prince said, "Okay, the rumor has already passed. It's healthy, so don't cry, sit down," and pointed to her seat. As they sat down on the table, they both noticed the actual empty vase. She asked the prince why he had removed the flowers she had given him earlier. She said she would give him new ones since those had withered. "Well, you kept them." The prince said he just left them because Madame had given them to him. "It's okay if she doesn't give him new ones." And then Rosetta realized that it was Madame LeBlanc who was dear to the prince, not Lady Luniella. "She's a special person," Rosetta said. "Madame LeBlanc is the nanny raising Armand. No wonder she cares for Armand. He was so sweet in Madame's presence. In a past life she loved her too." The prince asked Betty if she remembered to whom she had left the flowers. She said she had left them for the maid. "Do you mean Countess Milliam?" asked the prince. "Yes, she couldn't refuse the offer to deliver them for you." Rosette realized at once that, for one thing, Madame LeBlanc could not be the culprit. There's also no motive to kill a person not unlike a son. More importantly, Countess Milliam was a supporter of the current Empress. Again, Empress, it all comes down to her, Rosetta thought. And it seems that if it's the Empress, it's no wonder there's so little evidence left. Betty said it was unseemly for a babysitter to stay in an adult's room, so she would go. Betty and Rosetta went outside. Betty asked, "Miss, in the personal maid, the newspaper?" Replied, "Yes, it is." Betty told her how long she could hold out. But Rosetta said, "Don't worry, it's a pleasure for her to take care of His Highness. If you don't mind, can she ask a favor? It's a hassle because I can only count on you," Betty said. Rosetta said that she would do anything for His Highness, and with great pleasure. "Then I would," she continued, "want Rosetta to take care of His Highness tonight." "To court the prince? She can't fulfill that request at night," Rosetta said. "Gosh, Miss Rosetta, forgive me," said Betty. "She didn't mean that. She meant that it would be nice if you could drop by the prince's resting place in the afternoon too, to see if everything is all right." Rosetta exhaled. She'd already made up her own mind. She could just keep an eye on him. "Roger that," said Rosetta. "Madame, don't worry if the crowned prince doesn't want it." Betty laughed and said, "If the prince is on the fence about it, just remind him of my name. Then all objections will fall away in a flash." "All right," said Rosetta. Rosetta was already walking and planning her day. That way, if she prepared her firewood in advance during the day, she'd have all the time in the night to check on the prince. Betty, getting into the carriage, said, "Thank God there is such a marvelous girl as you beside the crowned prince." Rosetta said, "Thank you, and have a safe journey." Rosetta entered the palace and was about to begin her duties. But a maid met her and asked her what she was talking to Madame about. Rosetta said Madame had asked her to keep an eye on the crowned prince while he slept. The maid smirked, saying that he wasn't a boy anymore, but Madame was so patronizing him with such actions, and it wouldn't be long before rumors would spread. The maid said to Rosetta, "For your sake I will give you one warning. Your life is the closest to His Highness. To walk in the crowned prince's peace at a late hour is an extremely foolish act. It is evening." Rosetta, having taken a few logs of firewood, goes to the prince's room, but her mind is very full of thoughts. She has turned back time 4 times, but Only today I realized that the head maid is disliked by Madame LeBlanc. She had gotten it wrong so many times because she overlooked such details. As she approached the room, she saw a guard sleeping at his post. Rosetta said. The guard replied, "Good evening, Rosetta. What brings you here at this late hour?" She replied, "As you can see, I brought the firewood." I believe he was told to let the crowned prince in at night. The guard smiled and said, "But you can be let in." Walking into the prince's room, Rosetta thought the guard's words lacked vigilance. She didn't like it at all. As she approached the prince's bed, she believed he was all right, and gawked because he looked like an angel in her dreams. And then she got a little dreamy. She wished he could be such an angel in the daytime too, kind and calm. Here, at some point, the prince opened his eyes. Rosetta smiled at him and was glad. She thought they were going to have a conversation. Well, something has gone wrong, the prince thought. He grabbed Rosetta, threw her over himself, and flopped her on the bed without saying a word. Undressed, she said to him, "I apologize for my impertinence. Your sympathy is a misunderstanding. You misunderstood me. Madame LeBlanc asked me to do it." But the prince didn't react to the words or actions. His eyes were burning yellow. And then Rosetta remembered that yellow eyes meant he was sleepwalking. So she thought. First she needs to get out from under him. But he grabs her so tightly that she can't make it, and the prince starts kissing her. She cries out, "Come to your senses, Pasha! Highness! Misunderstanding!" She needed to do something about it immediately. Since she was a knight, she was able to straddle the prince and climb on top of him, at his head. She looks at him and he doesn't answer her, not as a man, but as some kind of beast. That's when things started to make sense. The rumor that the crowned prince had gone mad was not because of his stroppy temper, but because of his illness. She wondered, was he really like that with the other maids? So no, we need to focus on what's important, Rosetta thought. She placed her hand on his forehead and used her powers to bring him to his senses. His Highness coughed and saw Rosetta in front of him. He asked what she was doing here. Here the prince somehow changed. He invited Rosetta to sit down and drink tea, saying that this tea was good for inner peace. Rosetta replied, "Thank you for the tea, Your Highness." She was very surprised that His Highness had made the tea himself, and for her as well. Rosetta immediately decided to tell him that she was here for a reason. Madame LeBlanc had asked her to tell her so that the prince would not be angry, but he got right into the conversation. The prince asked her to tell him what she had seen. Rosetta began to talk about how the prince had completely failed to hear her and was showing his power. And as soon as I saw her in front of me, I jumped on her. The prince said he was probably like a beast that just follows its instincts. I thought about it while he slept. He made a mess again. I guessed right away. So it was the same with the other maids. "He's sorry for what just happened," the prince said. But did it immediately intercede, saying it was all right? She wasn't hurt. Said he must have used quite a bit of force. How could she manage? Rosetta said, as she had said before, "She's quite strong, not like all the maids." But the prince was surprised and said she must be joking, probably. Rosetta laughed, saying, "If you don't believe me, we can check and try arm wrestling with you." The prince said with pleasure, "You suggested it yourself, then don't cry." They began to fight for hands. Who was who? As cocky as she was, the result is obvious, the prince thought, and said, "You begin." Rosetta said, "I've already started." The prince said, as in literally 1 second she lowered his hand in the opposite direction, thus winning. He asked what woman could have such power to defeat a prince. She said she was so strong from birth, and decided to take the prince at his weakness, saying, "That's all you can do, Your Highness." "Your Highness, since I won, let me ask you a question," Rosetta said, and continued by asking the prince if he was going to kick her out by any chance. The prince immediately thought she wanted to ask if he was crazy to kick her out. Such a good maid. Rosetta said that, come to think of it, she didn't make a wish today that would fulfill her 1 wish a day. Rosetta asked, "Please don't fire me." That's her wish today. The prince asked, "Aren't you afraid of me after all that has happened?" "Well," Rosetta said, "you didn't do it on purpose." But he asked how she knew that. "Because you're a good person," Rosetta said, "and she still wants to be near you." Even the priest said he would not be able to cure the prince for years because of the severity of the disease. If the first prince found out about it, he would have an excuse to attack him, and no servant survived seeing this. But Rosetta has already saved the prince's life twice. She's a special maid, the best of all. He thinks Rosetta should move into the room next to his room, and in the future, she will be able to visit his room even at night and during the day whenever she wants, the prince said. He thought it would be weird to say she was special, because she was. It would be more correct to call her unusual, the crowned prince decided. The next day Rosetta went to Valyrian to tell him what had happened during the night. "The door," she said. "Valyrian, it's me, Rosetta." Valyrian immediately jumped up and ran to the door when he saw her. He was very happy that she had come here on her own. He asked, "And so what was she doing in the crowned prince's room at dawn?" Valyrian asked Rosetta, "What were you doing in that bastard's room before dawn?" "You're not talking about the crown prince now, are you?" Rosetta asked, "Otherwise calling his majesty that bastard." Valyrian shouted, "Please tell me it's not true!" He grabbed Rosetta's hand so hard it hurt. She asked, "Why is Valyrian so angry? What happened?" And Valyrian had already heard rumors. He said, "Everyone says she spent last night with the crown prince." Rosetta was really pissed off by that. "Who would spread such rumors?" she said. "And this must have been blabbed by that guard who fell asleep at his post," Valyrian guessed. "Yes, who dared spread such nonsense in the first place?" Valyrian exhaled and said, "Oh, so it really is just a rumor." He guesses he's a little overexcited. His mood lifted immediately. He said he was going to make Rosetta some coffee right away. Kept his promise, made a very tasty dessert as well as coffee. "Because of your pancakes, she can't eat properly now," Rosetta said. "Other food." "Of course, it's your favorite food," Valyrian replied. While eating a delicious dessert for breakfast, Rosetta thought it was amazing that she felt at home in this palace. Either way, she'll tell Valyrian. After all, even if he is the most gifted mage in the Empire, he has no access to her memories from her past lives. Valyrian said he couldn't wait to hear all the details from her with great pleasure. That's the reason why things have taken such a turn. Rosetta thinks so, but what does Valyrian think? Valyrian doesn't like that she's playing with time for this man. Or rather, not this man, but his majesty. For some reason Valyrian in this life hates Armand the crown prince with all his soul, Rosetta thought. Valyrian noticed that Rosetta had gotten hungry for dessert. The pancakes were delicious. He went over and wiped Rosetta's face as gently as he could. "And what will she do if she can't keep pretending to be a maid?" Valyrian said. "How about we dedicate this life to working together in his lab?" Valyrian said, licking cream off his finger. "If you set your mind to something, you have to see it through." "You probably left some for your favorite sister," Rosetta said, taking Valerie's hand. And licking his finger of the cream residue, Valerie thought, when did Rosetta, such a sweet little girl he grew up with, have time to turn into this seductive woman? Snatching his hand from Rosetta's arm, Valyrian said, "Rosetta, what is it you are?" But he looked at her with an innocent look and thought to himself, had she never considered that option? He said, "If she keeps looking at him like that, his heart can't take it." Rosetta told him, but he must know what she had turned back time for. She started to undo the top buttons of her blouse and says, "If you want to be a loving brother, there's one thing he can help her with." Valerie was startled, said Rosetta, "What's this?" But she pulled a list out of her blouse, and she said to him, "Yes, this is a list of all known poisons. Does he have any means of identifying them?" Rosetta asked. She knows there are such remedies, but the list is too extensive, and there are poisons here that she knows nothing about. Once more she asked, "Is she doing this for the crown prince? After all, Valyrian doesn't like him. But Rosetta, he's always happy to help. He can't forgive himself if she gets hurt." Rosetta said, "Thank you for always being willing to listen to her, Valyrian." Rosetta said that, unfortunately, it was time for her to leave already. "Why?" Valyrian asked. Rosetta said she decided to move into the room occupied by the crown prince's personal guard. It's right next to His Majesty's bedroom. She still needs to move all her things there. Was unhappy that it was the next room to the prince, but he couldn't say that to Rosetta. So he just said, "See you later." When Rosetta left, Valyrian said he hoped she understood. He had never been as jealous of her as he was now. Rosetta stood up and thought that the move shouldn't take so long. She would plan it now. Just then Melanie came running in. "How good of her to find her," the girl said. Rosetta asked, "What's the matter?" The girl asked, "Did you really spend last night together with the crown prince?" Rosetta became angry and shouted, "Who could say such a thing? Of course not!" Mila didn't say what Luke told her. "He saw you go into his resting place at night, and didn't come out until just before morning. Did he lie?" "No," said Rosetta. "I just fell asleep on the couch while I was cleaning up." Melanie didn't exhale and said, "Phew, she was afraid something was going to happen to Rosetie." But the girl asked another question. Then why are you moving? Because she is the crown prince's personal servant and must be closer to him. Melanie asked, You just said you wanted to be closer to the prince, didn't you? While the girls were talking, the prince came around the corner and decided to listen to their conversation. The prince was very curious about what they were chatting about, so he lurked so he wouldn't be seen. So you like him then? Melanie asked Rosetta, and the prince immediately tensed upon hearing this. You still wouldn't believe me if I said no. Melanie said, she's the type of person who always says there's no smoke without fire. The prince stopped and thought that Rosetta was in love with him, that there was no need to joke. As they went down to the kitchen, the girls saw that a crowd of maids had already gathered. They joined them. When the crowd dispersed, the girls saw that Sir Richard was standing, one foot on the ground, and the other foot on the back of the guard, who that night had seen Rosetta enter the prince's resting place. That guard shouted, I'm so sorry, Rosetta. Forgive me, lady, he was saying, but he was interrupted by Sir Richard. That you don't dare address Rosetta like that. Cheese, Richard, Rosetta said. Don't be so hard on him. Maybe it's just a little misunderstanding. No, he never liked his behavior. So this is a great opportunity to teach a good lesson in good manners, Sir Richard said. Then take care of anyone who dares to spread these rumors, Rosetta said. Melanie asked, Rosetta, don't you think he deserves a harsher punishment? She just wants people to forget about this story soon, Rosetta said. Rosetta noticed that the guard looked so tired. No wonder she'd found him asleep at his post. And then Richard heard the word sleeping, and he got angry and said, Is he gone while on duty? Grabbed a guard named Luke by the scruff of the neck and said, Now you and I are going to step outside for a second. Rosetta was all ready and was not happy about what was happening. Oh dear, perhaps she shouldn't have told Sir Richard about this. A little later, Rosetta came to the prince's room and began to clean up as usual, but she noticed something was wrong with him. He kept hiding his face under a book, pretending to read. Why is he acting so strange? Rosetta thought. Your Majesty, has she done something wrong? The girl asked. Well, gee, said the prince. That's all right, don't distract him. Then maybe you're not feeling well. Your face is so red, said Rosetta. Brad said he was fine. She asked, looking at her. The prince looked, but thought it wasn't like she knew he'd listened to her conversation with the maid. The prince was reminded of that conversation in the hallway, when Melanie had asked Rosetta what she had just said. That you want to be closer to the prince? Is that true? The prince immediately guessed that was why she had been acting so strangely all this time. This woman is trying to be with him because she's interested in him as a person, not as a crown prince. He couldn't understand why the thought made him so uncomfortable, or why he was constantly thinking about it. Rosetta turned to the prince, saying, Your Majesty, she has finished cleaning. Can she make a wish for today? The prince raised his head and asked, What wish do you want him to grant? Rosetta smiled and said, Please call her by her first name. The prince asked, What? Rosetta replied, Somehow you never say her name. He asked again, What difference does it make? Oh, Rosetta said, It's so nice when someone who plays an important role in your life calls you by your first name. The prince thought, Playing an important role? She could have been a little more modest. Fine, he said. Then he'll call her by name when he needs to. Rosetta said, Yeah, okay. But she was really hoping he would call her by name now. The prince decided to change the subject and asked, What did the priestesses tell her? That she's perfectly healthy and full of energy, and she has a long life ahead of her. Asked, Is that accurate? You may be free as soon as you finish your work, came the prince's voice. Undressed, she said. I obey, Your Majesty. She hopes he too will live a long and happy life. As she left His Majesty's room, Rosetta thought that she was very worried about the prince. He wasn't himself today, and she didn't know why he was like that. What if something happened to him? She thought. A voice came from behind her. Rosetta! Turning around, Rosetta saw the maid calling for her. Follow me, said the maid. Countess Milliam has been looking for Rosetta. Countess Milliam is a loyal supporter and confidant of the Empress. Entering the room, Rosetta said, Greetings, Countess Milliam. Is it you, His Majesty the Crown Prince's personal maid, of whom she has heard so much? Rosetta bowed and said, Yes, my lady, my name is Rosetta. I'm surprised His Majesty has finally agreed to a personal maid, said the Countess. You have a very pretty face, said the Countess. Rosetta thought it best to play dumb in situations like this and said, Thank you. It is so, Rosetta. Yesterday a vulgar girl like you entered His Majesty's room. Am I right? Madame LeBlanc assigned her to watch the fireplace in His Majesty's chamber, said Rosetta. The Countess laughed, saying she was so curious. She interjected, wondering if Rosetta had noticed anything strange. Was there anything frightening in His Majesty's room last night? The Countess asked. Rosetta thought she knew something, but the Countess only knows what her maid Maria knows, and Mary knows only that all the servants who happen to be in His Majesty's chambers at night, and the Crown Prince behaves usually fiercely after sundown. So something is strange, Rosetta thought. After all, she will say nothing. This, and to the woman specifically the truth. His Majesty sleeps so quietly. When she saw him, she was afraid the worst had happened. Countess said, "Ha! How she sees that she is not mistaken." She dared the Countess to tolerate liars. "Cut off her tongue," she ordered her guards. The guards rushed in and grabbed Rosetta, but she was perfectly capable of dealing with them in one blow. But if it went like this, she would no longer have the opportunity to pretend to be a maid. She screamed that she wasn't lying and swore, but one of the guards said, "With that one, hold still. She's about to lose her tongue, so you must choose your last words more carefully." Rosetta tried to calm herself. She had thought of different moves. Better to use force, to avoid or lose her tongue, but to keep His Majesty's secret hidden. She knew it would hurt like hell, but Valerie would be able to help her. "I understand," she said. She wouldn't be able to change the Countess's mind, but she really didn't know what she was talking about like that. The guard pulled out a dagger and said that if she kept talking and didn't twitch, it would be over quickly. For His Majesty's sake, Rosetta thought. The pain would pass quickly. She would even be willing to die for the prince. The guards were just about to start cutting their tongues when a man came into the room and said, "Are you having fun? Why did you grab that poor maid?" Greyhan Ishavet von Ragnar all abruptly fell to their knees and said that they saluted His Highness the First Prince. "What brings you here, Your Majesty?" the Countess asked. "He's here to visit his mother, but as he was walking down the hall he heard you fiddling, and now he's more interested in the fate of this poor servant girl. Could he just walk away, leaving a beautiful lady in distress? That girl does not deserve your attention, my lordship. She is but a personal servant of His Majesty the Crown Prince," said the Countess. The First Prince said it was even more interesting that way. He didn't know Armand had a personal maid. He walked over to Rosetta and told her to follow him. "They're going for a walk. Greyhan is the vilest man she's ever met." When she had been a knight in a previous life, he had constantly mocked and laughed at her because he believed that a woman was incapable of holding a sword. That vile bastard immediately forgot his words and tried to buy her when her talent was obvious to everyone. She's glad it didn't come to bloodshed. She's so annoyed with that bastard. "By the way, by what name may he remember his fair lady?" said the First Prince. "My name is Rosetta," the girl said, though she didn't like this conversation anymore. "Oh, Rosetta, I don't think I need to explain how dangerous the situation you find yourself in, and who saved such a beautiful girl, do I? And he hopes, she agrees with him, that her rescuer deserves a fitting reward." Undressed asked, "What reward are you waiting for first?" "Of course the worthy rewards for me would be your body," and he grabbed her waist. Greyhan Ishavet von Ragnar is the first prince of the Ragnar Empire and Armand's rival for the throne. Even though he was born a prince, no one was involved in his upbringing. Countess Mortemar raised Greyhain as heir to the throne. She fulfilled his every whim. That's why he grew up so messed up. He's the living embodiment of every mortal sin. The First Prince started groping Rosetta, and she thought that once she needed to teach the creep a lesson, just once. "Well, I'll start with this leg," she thought, and then a voice said, "I've been looking for you." "What are you doing here?" Armand asked, seeing Greyhan forcibly restraining Rosetta. Armand held out his hand to Rosetta and said, "Come to him." "Rosetta," he just called her by her first name. "Armand can be so gentle when you don't expect it at all," she thought. "Yes, Your Majesty," Rosetta said, and as she stepped away from Greyhain, tapped him with her elbow. As he walked away, Greyhain thought, "Wow, how strong she is that she was able to fight back." Armand stopped Greyhain and asked him what he wanted to do with his maid. Greyhain said he'd come all the way here for a common maid. Instead of dealing with such trivia, he'd rather focus on his engagement. "If you're not careful enough for his mother, maybe she'll find you a good match," Greyhain said. "Ha," thought Rosetta. As long as the Emperor's health leaves much to be desired, the right to choose a bride for the prince goes to his consort. That's why Armand postponed his engagement. Armand said, "You'd better mind your own business than meddle in his life." Armand feels sorry for Greyhound's bride-to-be. She won't be thrilled to see him chasing other girls. Or is he so angry because his bride does not boast a noble birth? Armin said. Greyhan hated Armin the very second he first saw him, the past childhood of two brothers. Greyhan, the little one, stands on the balcony of the palace and thinks that now he will be a prince and can live in the imperial palace. He wants the whole empire to lie at his feet. He overheard two maids talking under the balcony. One said she heard that the new prince had arrived. Yes, and though he is of a noble family, yet only Armand has the blood of an emperor in him. At first, Greyhan paid no attention to Armand. There was no need. After all, that one was the youngest. His boy like Armand would not be able to stand up to Greyhan. But then suddenly everything began to compare the two of them. Their academic success, their skill with a sword. Tried to piss him off and teach him a lesson in front of everyone. But he just ignored it. And when it came to fighting, Greyhan always accused Armand of complaining to his father about his abuse of him. But Armand denied that he complained. He never even spoke to his father. Armand always said that his brother should realize that they were always the center of attention. Damn, Greyhan thought. If only he knew how to make it look like Armand was the one who attacked him. His father always knew Greyhan was bullying his younger brother, though Armand never complained to his father. Greyhan turned to his mother. Something must be done about Armand, he said. Greyhan, be patient. You must face it now so that you can triumph over him in the future. After saying that, it was easier for him to contain his emotions. But now, present tense, Greyhan thought that he couldn't become emperor as long as his younger brother lived. Greyhan said, "You fool!" and swung his fists at his younger brother. Armand thought it would be very easy to deflect his blow, but if it left marks on his face, he could use the situation to his advantage. In the split second between them, Rosetta managed to stand up to the prince's defense, and the blow hit Rosetta right in the face. The girl collapsed in pain and lost consciousness. Armand was very frightened for Rosetta. He began to shout, calling for the girl to wake up. Greyhan asked, "She's not dead, is she? If word of this gets out, he'll be known as a lowlife who takes it out on maids for any reason." Greyhan began to slowly back up and walk away from the scene. Armand saw his brother running away and said to him, "Greyhan, where are you going?" "Don't think you'll get away with it so easily," Armand shouted. Armand tried to calm himself so that he could help Rosetta as soon as possible. He would deal with his brother later. Damn it, Rosetta, why is she always trying to protect him? Armand thought. Rosetta opened her eyes and asked, "Is Greyhan gone already? What did you think of Rosetta's acting? Was she very convincing?" Someone asked. "That wretch doesn't have the strength to do that much damage to her," Armand said. "Why, how? Why is she acting so recklessly?" Armand asked the girl. "She's not acting recklessly. She's just looking out for His Majesty's welfare." Rosetta looked at his expression and realized that the prince was angry. His Majesty could not bear to see a woman abused. He can't even imagine that she was a master swordsman. The prince took Rosetta in his arms and carried. He said she needed the help of a priest. After a blow like that, not everyone could take it. Rosetta said she could walk by herself and she wasn't even hurt. But the prince said, "Be quiet. I will carry you to the temple myself." She thought, just like that in front of everyone, he's lost his mind. Rosetta began to capriciously demand that he let her go, that it was very embarrassing for her, and that it would not be better to summon a priest, as Father Theodore had done before. The prince said, "Well done, way to go. You keep chattering even after such a hard blow." They're back at the palace. The prince and Richard are waiting outside the door. Sir Richard asked, "Lady Rosetta, hurt? Then why are you here and not with her?" The prince replied, "Because of herself." Rosetta said she wouldn't let a priest near her in front of outsiders. Sam thought for a moment. It seemed strange to him that His Majesty was not as harsh with Rosetta as he had been before. The prince wondered to himself. To be honest, he felt different around her. When he sees this maid, his heart starts beating faster. More than that, he wants to touch her, to hold her against him. He'd be lying if he said he didn't want to spend more time with Rosetta. The prince said, "Missing something?" In the room, Rosetta told the priest that she knew he had come here to lend aid to His Majesty, not her, and begs his forgiveness. The priest said he was honored that Rosetta thought so highly of him. Theodore, a very talented priest, but in this life, his abilities were not noticed. Moreover, Theodore has lost the trust of the high priest. Excellent news for His Majesty. Yes, it is true, but what she has to say must remain between them. His Majesty wishes to declare you his personal priest, Rosetta said. Theodore exclaimed that it couldn't be. If the high priest is displeased with him, Theodore is definitely not an ally of the Empress. Rosetta thought. They could use people like him. Theodore said he was so excited that he almost forgot his duties, and asked what happened to Rosetta. The girl replied that nothing had happened. She felt perfectly well. But His Majesty is greatly concerned, Theodore said. Rosetta said it was just a scratch and no big deal. Leaving the room, the prince asked, "Are you finished?" Rosetta said, "Yes, she is much better now." Prince said he thanked Theodore for arriving as soon as possible. Theodore smiled and said he was honored by your sympathy. The prince said he had a question for Theodore. Rosetta was recently poisoned with a poison called setar. How did she do it? Rosetta was really scared because she could get in trouble if she didn't think of something right away. And she said she had something to say. Walking up to the prince, Rosetta whispered something in his ear. The prince said, "Father Theodore, please excuse us." When Theodore left, the prince turned to Rosetta and asked what she wanted. To come to her room tonight? "What are you thinking of, your highness?" asked Rosetta. "You told me last night that you sometimes feel the symptoms of the disease even during the day when you experience a serious shock," Rosetta said. "But I didn't experience any shocks today, which can't be said for you." Prince said that if he were her, he'd better worry about her. Rosetta immediately remembered the previous night, when she had learned that the prince was sleepwalking. "Now that's trouble, my poor crown prince," Rosetta said. "His Majesty, he is the most refined of any aristocrat she has ever known." Night came and Rosetta stayed with the prince, now more like a wild beast, revealing his vicious desires to the world. Somnium is a disease for which there is no cure, but this diagnosis was made by the high priest. The collusion between the high priest and the empress leads Rosetta to believe that it is a lie, more like a very strong curse, the source of which is probably powerful magic. Not even Valyrian can dispel it, Rosetta thought. The prince took a swing at Rosetta, but she managed to wave him off by saying, "Ah, your majesty!" He backed off because she was able to fight back against the prince. Oh, he's acting like her cat Valo when she tried to bathe him. Then maybe he really is turning into a beast. Except Armand isn't her cat Valo. "Your majesty, look," said Rosetta. She took her dust broom. It was fluffy with feathers and began to play with the prince. And what she had envisioned happened. The prince started jumping around like a kitten and playing with that stick. But their game didn't last long at all. The prince jumped a couple of times, and Rosetta thought it was so much fun. But then he suddenly pounced on Rosetta, and the game was over. She shouted, "Wait, Veil, your majesty, stop!" She said, "No," and shoved him away with all her strength. "Hop on the bed," she said to the prince. "She's in charge here now, and today you will learn the meaning of the word no." She jumped on top of him. Thanks to the cat, she has learned something, thought Rosetta. She lay down next to the prince on the bed, covered his mouth with her hand, and said, "Your Majesty, you can't do this. Patience is always rewarded." He raises his hand, she puts it down and says, "You can't." And after a few repetitions, when he tried to stand up or swing his arm, Rosetta would say, "You can't," or "Yuck," and the prince would calm down, trying to lie still. While they fought and Rosetta tried to teach him cat behavior, she fell asleep next to him. She was sure they would work it out in time. The next morning came. There was a knock in the prince's room. It was Richard, his assistant, knocking, saying, "Your Majesty, you are not awake yet. Will you allow him to enter the room?" The prince heard Richard knocking on the door. He woke up, grabbed his head because it hurt so much. So he realized there had been another attack during the night. So he let Richard come in. When the prince opened his eyes, he couldn't understand why the blanket was so big. Then the prince lifted it up and saw Rosetta lying on it. And Sir Richard was just saying he was coming in. The prince became very agitated and wondered what she was doing here. The door opens and Sir Richard enters. He sees that the prince's blanket is somehow strangely high. Sir Richard asks, "Your Majesty, are you well?" Prince, before Richard came in, had his head covered and was lying under a blanket. He says he's not feeling very well. Richard asks the prince if he is not feeling well. Perhaps he should call a priest to help him. The prince replies that it is nothing and not worth bothering the priest. At this point, Rosetta wakes up and wants to remove the blanket, but the prince prevents her from doing so. Sir Richard sees that something is happening on the bed. The blanket is up and down. He asks the prince, "Are you sure you're okay?" The prince shouts back, "Yes, I'm fine, I just stretched." Richard asks, "Did you pull yourself up under the blanket?" "It shouldn't concern you. Go on with your rounds." During this time, while the prince is talking to Richard, Rosetta thinks she must be crazy. How could she have fallen asleep in the prince's bed? Richard says he has to submit a report and can't leave. Last night, Richard received word that one of our men had discovered an unknown person on the palace grounds. But the prince, instead of listening to what Richard is saying, thinks he has lost his mind. She lies on his arm so close to him that she can hear his excited pulse. My mind tells me to push her away, but my heart tells me to get closer. Any other maid he would have punished long ago and thrown her out of the palace. But for some reason, he can't do that to her. Now the prince finally realized at last. All this time he had been tormented by guilt, that inexplicable feeling bubbling up inside him, ruling his body against his will. But it doesn't explain why he feels so strange. It's time to admit it. Armand is attracted to Rosetta in some strange way. He doesn't know why. Your Majesty, Richard said, reading from the report. The prince shouted that he had already said he was not feeling well, and asked Richard to leave. The prince sighed at the fact that Richard wouldn't leave, and continued to torment him. Richard says fearfully, begging his pardon, Your Majesty. The prince kept thinking about his mind being enveloped in a fog. Richard says, If I may leave with your permission, Your Majesty. When Sir Richard has left, Rosetta asks why the prince was so cruel to him. The prince resents Rosetta for being in his bed and allowing herself to do such a thing. It's a misunderstanding. She had watched over him all night while he was suffering from his illness, and in the morning she had accidentally fallen asleep in his bed. The prince asks how she was able to restrain him. Rosetta says she did and tries to explain that he was acting calm. She thinks it was more like training than restraint. It's no use. When asked about the cure, all the priests just shrugged their shoulders. Maybe his feelings for Rosetta affected him yesterday? Thank you, says the prince. It's all thanks to you. No, I did it because I wanted to myself, Rosetta replies. The prince says he's probably not the easiest person to deal with. Yes, you were very persistent. I know I used force, the prince says. Rosetta thinks he was striving to accomplish his goals this night. She always knew he was strong, but now he can tell that some men are much weaker than she is. Are you going to make a wish today? I already owe you one, says the prince. Of course I will, says Rosetta. She wants to go to the library with the prince. The prince can lend her his map, but there's no point in going there together. Prince thinks she wants to ask him out on a date. This will allow Rosetta to keep a quieter eye on him. The prince agrees, though, and they go to the library. Okay, I'll take a book then, Rosetta says. Prince is thinking about how to make a good impression on a date. Funny, he always turned women down without regret. Prince offers to help Rosetta by knowing where every book in the library is located. The prince comes too close to Rosetta. She wonders why he is so close. The other maids are already discussing the prince and Rosetta's relationship. She was looking for a book on cat parenting and found it. The prince interjected, Do you have a cat, Rosetta? She replied that yes, I had recently picked one up. She will put this book down for herself because she needs time to study it properly. Or maybe she should stop worrying about the rumors, which are inevitable anyway. And then Rosetta turned and saw Valerie in the library. She went up to him and asked him what he was doing here. Valerie replied that he had come to see Rosetta because he missed her so much. Rosetta asked how he knew she was here. Valerie replied that he had his own methods. Valerie asked, Why are you blushing so red? Are you not feeling well? Rosetta said it's just a little hot in here. Valerius saw Armand and asked Rosetta if she was sure he had nothing to do with it. Rosetta turned and saw the prince walking in her direction. Get out quick, hide me, Rosetta said, standing up behind his back. Valerius said, Sure, whatever you say. The prince walked the corridors of the library and called out to Rosetta, but she hid and did not respond. The prince stopped, looked to see that she wasn't here, and left. Rosetta stood beneath Valerius's covered sleeve, which used magic to conceal her. We hadn't been this close before. Where did these scary feelings come from? Rosetta thought. As they stood in Adler, Valerie reflected on the fact that the last time Rosetta had seemed to him quite different from what he had never known. Her eyelashes are very long and her eyes are blue. He only noticed that now. And we've been back in time many times, but now development is only 20 years old. A lot of girls her age are just starting to date, Valerie thought. Rosetta asked what kind of magic it was. This is a magical robe. It can make the wearer invisible and muffle their footsteps. Though still, even with her you have to be quiet, Rosetta said. Valerie pulled some kind of box out of her pocket and told her, Here, take this. Rosetta saw him pull something out and immediately thought it was probably her present. Valerie opened the box and there were cufflinks, very beautiful, with blue stones. Even Rosetta felt the magic emanating from those cufflinks when she picked them up. She thought they were under a very high-level spell. Valyrie said to give them to the prince. If any danger arises, she will always be able to move to their owner in an instant. Rosetta asked how he did that. Because he knows she doesn't have time to see him while she's guarding the prince, Valyrie replied. This necklace is connected with cufflinks, Valyrie said, holding out her hand, on which lay a small pendant, the most ordinary, modest one. If just a maid were to wear something flashy and expensive, it might arouse suspicion. So he made this pendant look like costume jewelry. Naturally, this necklace will fit, Valyrie said. A fine choice, Rosetta said. Rosetta took a closer look at the cufflinks and pendant. She thought they looked like a pair of jewelry for lovers. Thank you, Valyrie. But now she must go to His Majesty. Valyrie said, Wait a second, Rosie, and ran up to catch up with her. He wants to put that necklace on her himself, he told Rosetta. Rosetta asked, What, he thinks she can't handle it? Valyrie said, You don't wear jewelry. All right then, Rosetta said. Help me put it on. Rosetta turned her back to him, tilted her head, moved her hair away from her neck so Valyrie could comfortably fasten the clasp. Valyrie asked Rosie, Did you tell the prince that this isn't your first life? Rosetta said no, she hadn't yet, but she would tell him someday. Valerius asked, Do you need anything, Rosetta? She said that if he had time this weekend, she wanted to buy some new clothes. Valyrie said he always had time for her, Rosie. Rosetta returned to the prince. He, when he saw her, was angry and said, Why did she go away without warning him? Pardon me, your majesty, when you meet an old friend, time passes unnoticed, Rosetta said. But the prince was in no mood. He said indignantly again that she knew how long he had waited. Rosetta decided to change the subject and said, Were you worried about her? She asked the prince. The prince said that yes, he was worried, and that she dare not disappear like that again without his permission. Rosetta couldn't even imagine what she had done to deserve such attention from the prince today. She thought the prince felt guilty about it. That's why he was so attentive to her. She said, Your Majesty, I have something for you, a compliment. Stretched out her hand to the prince, and there lay 2 beautiful cufflinks of blue-colored stones. The prince looked at those cufflinks and wondered how she could afford such luxury with her salary. The prince asked, Do they belong to her, these cufflinks? Prince said to Rosette, Wait, you want to wear couples stuff? Because he noticed she had the same pendant with the same flowers as his cufflinks. So she bought jewelry that normally a maid wouldn't be able to afford. Nevertheless, even with her you have to be quiet. The prince accepted the gift, cufflinks, said thank you, Rosetta. We'll wear them every day. Rosetta thought, Like it that much? Or did he say that out of respect for me? Still, he has no return gift, the prince said. That's all right. She doesn't need anything in return, Rosetta replied. The prince said it was unacceptable. His upbringing did not allow him to remain indebted to the girl. He would surely think of something. He said he noticed she didn't have many outfits, so he called a tailor. Rosetta said you shouldn't have. A friend promised her to buy her new clothes this weekend, Rosetta said. What friend? The prince asked. A close childhood friend, the girl replied. Well, he said. I see. A lot of girls love shopping. Rosetta said, Oh no, her friend is a man. And a man is going to help pick out her dresses? How unusual, said the prince. Does he know so much better about fashion than most women? Replied Rosetta. He carefully selects his closet every day, so he's going to help her, Prince said. The prince said, Cancel your meeting. Rosetta asked, Why? You're going shopping with the prince. There's no better reason to go out, he said. Why did you suggest it so suddenly? Asked Rosetta. The prince thought she thought he was inferior to her friend in the matter of choice of clothing. Then he's expecting her tomorrow afternoon. Somewhere, she thought. What's the matter with him? The next day came. Rosetta and the prince met and got into the carriage together for a trip to get clothes. As they drove along, Rosetta wondered what all these things were coming from exactly in her current life. Well, now that she's out of the palace, she should get some proper rest, Rosetta thought. She was supposed to have fun on her day off with Valyrie. The whole ride is silent. Neither the prince nor Rosetta speaks to each other. Everyone is thinking to himself. She disappeared during our first date and wanted to meet another man on her day off, thought the prince. Who she trusts enough to let him into the fitting room. Is it just him, or can only engaged or lovers be in the same fitting room? He can't believe he's been curbed by jealousy. She enjoyed our date, the prince thought. Promises the next one will be even better. No, she'll be thrilled. You really like him, don't you? The day of the date has come, the one that should be the best. Rosetta hasn't made any preparations, but she still has time before she meets the prince. Walking down the hallway, she reasoned that she just needed to get out early and get through the day. Just then, Melanie, the maid, is greeted in the hallway by the counter. Rosetta, Rosetta, are you really going to go in this? Asked Melanie, and Rosetta interjected. What's wrong with it? Didn't you say you had a date with His Majesty today? Rosetta said, It's only a walk, just a reward for her help, and she wants to say it's not a date. Even if he just decided to thank her, that counts too. His Majesty doesn't place much importance on the sight of her appearance. No, when it comes to the imperial family, she has to fit in, especially on a walk with His Majesty, Melanie said. Rosetta said, Do you think so? Melanie didn't answer. Quick, follow her. Wait, there wasn't, said Rosetta. Asking questions is forbidden, replied the maid. She has just about everything that Rosetta is obligated to try. Rosetta always looks amazing no matter what dress she's wearing, so clothes don't matter to her. Even as an aristocrat, she never looked down on those around her. Her clothes are as simple as the other maids. She is deeply loyal to the imperial family. She's very strange, Rosetta. That's why I like her, Melanie said. When Rosetta changed her clothes, she went to meet the prince. Melanie wished her luck. When Rosetta came out, the prince was already standing by the carriage waiting for her. Greetings, Your Majesty, Rosetta said. When the prince saw her, he opened his mouth at her beauty. Rosetta was indeed very beautiful. She had a gorgeous long scarlet-colored dress, and her hair was well put in. He always knew that this maid was very beautiful. When they first met, hadn't she attracted special attention from him? But now that she's changed from her uniform to a dress, he just can't take his eyes off her. When she began to mean so much to him, the prince became agitated. Rosetta noticed something was amiss and asked again, Your Majesty, are you not feeling well? No, don't worry about me, I'm fine, the prince replied. He held out his hand for Rosetta to step up into the carriage and said, Please. Gosh, Rosetta, I couldn't believe she was going to be accompanied by the prince himself. Being a knight, Rosette had always been in the shadows. Now she was embarrassed that she couldn't gather her thoughts. Prince asked Rosetta if she was worried because it felt too much like a date. When they got into the carriage, Rosetta asked again where they were going with the prince. To Tranches, it's time to buy a decent dress for Rosetta. If they're really going there, they'll be picking her out the most expensive dress in the Empire's store to date. A place where only the upper class and aristocracy gather. That's all she knows about modern fashion. Your Majesty, it's too popular, Rosetta said. I'm sure they're booked up a month in advance. Prince said she sometimes forgets who he is after all. The carriage pulled up to this major store in the Empire. She and the prince walked into this beautiful big store. They were greeted by a saleswoman with the words, Greetings, Your Majesty, Crown Prince. The inside of the store was very nice and lots of things, clothes, accessories. The saleswoman approached the prince to ask why they had come. It is an honor to see you here, Your Majesty. The girl's name was Lydia, and she was the hostess of the establishment in question. Lydia asked who she could help pick out a decent outfit. The prince replied, I am here for my maid. Lydia interjected, wondering what she had done to deserve such attention, and Rosetta went to look at all the dresses and fabrics. She'd never been into that before. The prince said that the price didn't matter, and the saleswoman could pick out a dozen dresses that Rosette would like. Rosette, hearing the word, turned around and said that was a lot. She would like a couple. The prince turned and went with the words, Go on, I'll wait for you here. Lydia suggested that Rosetta look at a catalog that showed different dresses. Rosetta sat down on the sofa and began leafing through a catalog of dresses, saying that she didn't understand why His Majesty was so strange. Glamour is in vogue now, Rosetta remarked, leafing through the dresses. It is. This establishment is incredible. However, when the fashion for colorful outfits wears off, Tranches will lose its popularity. Rosetta looked at a beautiful blue dress. She liked it best. When the saleswoman Lydia came over, Rosetta said, This dress, please. Lydia came over and said that she shouldn't rush her decision. She thought the girl would choose more dresses, but Rosetta had already made up her mind. In fact, Rosetta doesn't really like the dress in this store. It was not customary to speak like that in high society, so Lydia thought to herself how rudely this girl had answered. Lydia took offense at the girl's decision, and thought that she should only give this maid a hint, and she would immediately realize that she didn't belong here. Rosetta went into the dressing room where she could change and try on her dress in peace. But as soon as she got in there and had time to take off her dress, Lydia came into her room, opening the curtain where Rosetta was changing. Lydia said that there seemed to be a slight mistake. All the girls who came into that store stood and saw Rosetta almost naked. Another customer has already placed an order for this dress, Lydia said, and I have to take it back. She walked over to Rosetta, took the blue dress, and left. Rosetta stood there, not realizing if Lydia had only decided to say that when she walked into the fitting room. It was clear this establishment was for nobles. There was no room for a penniless maid like her. She didn't dare say it to the crown prince's face, so Lydia decided to point out the rarefied her place. Rosetta changed into her dress she had arrived in, came out of the fitting room and said, "It is the custom here that the customer must pay for mistakes." All the girls who were standing in that store turned and looked at Rosetta. Even if she just wants to purchase a dress, she will have to overcome quite a few challenges. "It's scary to imagine what your regular customers go through every time," Rosetta said. "I understand you're disappointed you can't get what you want. But young lady, please refrain from being rude," Lydia said. She had no idea where Rosetta had come from, but here she would have to behave as befitted a noble lady. "Yes, you're right," Rosetta said. "Still, this establishment can't offer her anything worthwhile. However, she wants to hear you apologize for entering the fitting room without permission, while hoping for her understanding in the situation this establishment finds itself in due to your fault." "That's the way a noble lady should do it," Rosetta told Lydia with a casual servant's expression. "It looks like she's not going to get an apology from you, so let me take my leave," Rosetta said. Then a voice came from the room. "Stand where you are!" When Rosetta turned around, she saw a girl in her blue dress. The girl asked if she was the one who wanted to steal her dress. The girl said that this dress was meant for a lady at a social gathering, but not for ordinary kitchen laundresses, much less maids. "Behave according to your position, know your place. She's quite suited to those cheap rags you're wearing," said the girl, who wore a blue dress. Rosetta said it was this girl who was forcing her to teach her a lesson. While the girls were squabbling, all the while the prince stood on the balcony and listened. He did not wait for Rosetta to teach the lesson. He came down and said, "How dare the girl throw such phrases at her companion?" The girl who wore the blue dress and Lydia saw the crown prince. They were terrified. Undressed too, when she saw the prince, she wondered how he got here. The girl who wore the blue dress immediately became embarrassed, laughed and said, "Your Majesty, this place is for women." She also laughed and said, "Your Majesty, it's okay, she's fine." After being insulted like that, how can you be okay? Is that all you have to say? Even if she thinks nothing unusual happened, it's not enough for him. Rosetta smiled and said, "Your Majesty, let's go somewhere else. She knows a better establishment." "It's just that the longer they linger here, the more trouble it will bring," Rosetta said. "Please, let's go." The prince said, "All right, if you insist, we'll go." But before he left, he looked very angrily at the two girls, the saleswoman, and what you might call a stolen blue dress, that their behavior would not be forgotten by him. Prince and Rosetta left this store, got into a carriage, and drove on. About a dress from 10 tailors for His Majesty. That's a mere trifle, Rosetta thought. She's just a servant. Why is he being so nice to her and sticking up for her or something? Maybe if she told him that her life wasn't in danger, maybe he'd be glad. Rosetta decided to start the conversation by saying, "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. You had to intervene because of her." But the prince said he had no desire to listen to anything Rosetta had to say. He asked her why she kept apologizing. "Somewhere," interjected that, "Well, in situations where it's not her fault," said the prince. "Why is she apologizing because he's the only one who cares about her? If she doesn't like it, she needs to be nice and learn to fend for herself. She doesn't deserve to be treated like that by anyone." Rosetta said, "Yes, Your Majesty, thank you." But the prince was still not pleased. He said she was too kind, thanking him for reprimanding her. "She doesn't deserve to be treated that way," Rosetta said. "Then why is she more worried about him than herself?" the prince asked. "Because you're her master," Rosetta said. "It does it for his sake." In that second, Armin realized everything. If they were characters in a novel, then the reader would have guessed at once, as well as the bird hovering above them, that it was without a doubt a declaration of love. However, Rosetta didn't notice anything of the sort. The prince was prepared for it, but such a confession shocked him. What courage it takes to get close to someone who's about to die, the prince thought. And this altercation in the tranche store, Rosetta isn't just going to let it all go, the girl said. The prince asked. She changed the subject simply because he didn't say anything. "If so, what is she going to do?" "She needs a small favor from him, Your Majesty." almost like a wish she makes every day. They went somewhere, and it was the clothing store Rosetta was talking about. The prince asked, "Is she going to exact her revenge with this tiny establishment? Do you know why all noble ladies are in such a hurry to find new outfits for themselves?" Rosetta said. "There's a ball at the Imperial Palace in a week. As you know, this is the last opportunity to find a companion before the hunting tournament. So she decided to purchase the most beautiful and exquisite dress here, which she can wear and who will accompany her to the ball. And perhaps the best choice would be a blue dress to teach a good lesson." When they arrived at this store, they were also met by a woman who serves customers. The girl saw the prince and said, "Are you a new customer?" He replied that he was, and would like to order a dress. The girl asked, "Do you know someone who will be wearing the dress you buy today?" The prince said, "Of course, isn't it obvious? This is the girl I came with."